in that case, I suggest we start with the end of the presentation, and then you'll discover what the project is about. So at the European Data Portal, so I'm speaking here as consortium lead for a project that's actually been carried out by DG Connect of the European Commission. And what we do at the European Data Portal is that we harvest open data made available by public administrations across Europe. So every single public sector information that is made publicly available on a national or a regional data portal is progressively being harvested onto this central access point. What does this central access point offer? It offers information about the information. So it's not the holy grail yet. It's not everything that's available everywhere. It's translated metadata for now into 15 languages and in February into 24 languages about every single piece of information that is openly made available. But besides that, what do we do? So we offer metadata, as I mentioned, and that metadata can be accompanied by a series of visualizations, also quality checks, further information about the data, its frequency, its origin, the frequency of the updates, etc. But on the European Data Portal, we also train. So we train publishers or anybody who's interested in open data in actually following some e-learning modules or using some training materials or modules in their own context to help accompany anybody, a small one or a larger organization, understand what it takes to publish open data. And we heard in one of the earlier presentations, okay, but to have an open data, you actually need an open license, because by default, anything that you find on the internet, it's not because it's there that you can make use of it. So without an open license, your data is not freely usable, it's not freely accessible, and it cannot be reused for any purpose. We also showcase. So we showcase a number of events, of news, of best practices, of reports. We got a request, for instance, this morning from the region of Toscane in Italy, where they want some support at the European level to gain visibility in an open data initiative that they would like to launch to publish more data freely available, which currently now is withheld by public administration. So that's just one example of how showcasing at the European level can help any form of administration or organization get visibility and get, I would say, the nudge through the door to publish more data openly and freely. We also measure open data maturity across Europe. We just published a report for the International Open Data Conference in October, where we see what countries are doing with open data, because there's a lot of talk about all of this, but who's actually walking the talk and who's going into the details of these licensing, of publishing more than the low-hanging fruit, because it's very good creating a data portal, but if that's just a central access point to the data that's already available, the value comes from, I would say, making data that might be charged for, or that might not be made available for whatever reason that might be. So by measuring, we create, I would say, peer pressure across Europe, but also learning experiences, best practices that are shared in this domain. So we convene meetings, seminars, events as well. We organize some of our own events. We've got something back-to-back with a European Parliament event on open data at the end of November, for instance, and a lot of activity online in terms of webinars. But we also collect. So by collecting, we collect stories of organizations or countries that have been publishing data, or users who have been looking into data from different countries. So there was, during the European Week of Cities and Regions, for instance, someone from Spain who started up a company using data that was both private and publicly available across Spain, Italy, but also even Peru, to start looking into the real value of real estate markets. So all of that data is accessible, and if you make it accessible in a multilingual context, I would say the overall benefits of the data is exponential. So we also share, which means everything we do, as this is a contract under the European Commission, every line of code that we've written for what I've just described is freely open for reuse, and it's on GitLab. And you might say, okay, but this is a language resource conference. That's very nice what you're telling us, Wendy, but what is in it for me in terms of language and translation? So before getting to that, a few facts and figures. When we're talking about this portal, we're talking about 638,000 different data sets that are referenced across 34 countries. That's 71 catalogs, and that list is growing at the time being. When we started the journey a year ago, we only had 240,000 data sets. and the metadata was only available in 3 languages. Right now we've got 15 languages, so I'll let you do the maths in terms of language pairs. But that's basically what we're facing in terms of challenges. And part of what we do in the field of multilingualism is that we've got 3 challenges. We've got, I would say, dynamic content, and you might say, oh, but what you call dynamic content might be called by a static content, but I've called the metadata part dynamic because that is metadata that is harvested on a daily basis. So it's coming in, it's going out, it's going to MTITC, and it's coming back to the portal at a very high speed. So I'm talking about 1,000 to 2,000 changes per day in those 15 target languages. So how do we deal with that? Basically, what we decided together with DGT and within DG Connect was to pilot LiveScale in a productive environment, a connector to the MTITC. So if you imagine that we have MTITC on one side, a country data catalog on one side, and then on the other side, the European data portal. What we do is we harvest the metadata on the country portal. We send that in a batch of 40 language lines to MTITC, simply naming the language source and the target language that we want it translated in. We then take that batch from MTITC and transpose it to the European data portal. And everything that goes onto the portal is done in an asynchronous fashion to go directly onto the source, onto our source. So here, harvesting data from the country, that goes to MTITC, we collect it back from MTITC, and we put it onto the portal. Have we done anything to adapt MTITC? We've left it as it is. What we've developed in an open source format is actually that connector that enables to collect the information from that data catalog in whatever 24 language, and then pull it back out of MTITC to put it onto our portal. And it's working pretty okay, knock on wood. We're sharing a lot of feedback in terms of not so much language quality, in terms of language pairs, but a lot around performance issues, around high volume translations, around backlogs, around accessing workflows into the tools. So hopefully feeding in a lot of feedback to provide, I would say, the MTITC version 2.0, or some form of e-translation service that can actually provide for the volume that we're feeding the tool. Because today, we've already, I would say, enhanced the performance of the tool by 3 or by 4 since we started. So if you look at the 3 languages we had before and you compare that to the 240,000 data sets that we had translated, today we're at 640,000 in 15 languages. So to make that possible, we've had to increase the capacity. And the next challenge is to add in the remaining 9 languages, which will actually be a very big performance challenge for MTITC. So we're going to run quite a number of tests on that as the frequency harvests and as the data also increases. Because one of the challenges then is to say, well, if we do have more and more data being translated, going through all these automated translation tools, how is the tool going to handle it as well? How is the performance going to be? Not simply the quality of the language pairs. And here, for instance, via the European Data Portal, we're also raising awareness around automated translation, because many municipalities or local portals will say, but how on earth did you get my Finnish city's data, well, information about the data, translated into Polish? Can we do that too? Or cross-border regions who say, well, is there a means by which us as a region can get our data into German, Slovenian, Italian, French, so on and so forth? So we're actually running into many authorities who want to call the same services, which will therefore, I would say, increase the challenge for the performance of the system as well. And ideally, the better the quality of what's fed in, because people do understand that what they are actually providing us goes into automated translation. They want higher results in terms of quality, so they actually see that their translations appear in, I would say, a user-friendly way. They will also improve the quality of the source language, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. So that's for the automated translation. The rest of what we do is 99% of the time directly translated by humans, because I'm going to be talking here about more editorial content for the main pages of the website or for voiceovers for videos. And at this stage, well, part of the challenges we've been facing when we started at the beginning is we put it initially into MTITC, or we run it through automated translation tools, and the feedback from our translators was it takes us too much time to correct the machine translation than it does to do the real translation ourselves. So we left automated translation to the metadata because that's too high volume for humans to translate. And for the static content and editorial content, it's available in the source language, which is English, and then translated by professionals. But the funny thing is, we've had feedback on the portal on a number of aspects, and we've run a few user sessions with people who use data, people who publish data, and hardly no one has ever said the translation is bad. So it means that when you manage people's expectations and they know it's machine translation, they know that our metadata is usually unstructured text or tags or sometimes sentences without a specific context, they're going to take it for what it is. They're not going to judge the fact that the translation might not be perfect. A few lessons learned from our experience is to be or not to be synchronous versus asynchronous. That was part of our first questions when we developed the better version of the portal. And here we realized that if you really want multilingualism all the way, on-the-fly doesn't work, simply put, because when you use on-the-fly translation, you cannot search multilingually. If you want to search, for instance, the word milk, well, you're going to have to select one language and then filter out the language you want it to be applied in. But if you want to search for milk, but you also want it to search for milk, milch, latte, etc., you can only do that via asynchronous translation because your bulk that is searched through actually needs that multilingual facet to it. So on the fly is good, but it might limit some user functions here. A second lesson learned as well here is to be fast or slow. And that's something else that we've been seeing today is if you want very high quality search engines, of course you can use Google, but I would say that poses then a question around IPR. Are you willing to give away your data to Google? That's Article 14. It's written black on white, so you can take a look at it yourself. Or are you willing to make your users wait? Yes, no. And if you want a page to load in 14 seconds, well, today everybody wants something available within a click, and the faster the click is, the better and the more reliable the source will be considered. If you have to wait for 13 seconds, you can be pretty sure that your user will leave your page. So that's also one of the reasons why we went for asynchronous. So to do, as I explained, all that translation in the back office, and then when the translations are ready, to put them onto the portal. The third lesson learned we had as well is, what do you choose? Do you want perfection, or do you simply want multilingualism to be available? And here, as I mentioned a bit earlier, well, we have noticed that the fact of having data available in different languages is actually a stimulus as opposed to a barrier. It might not be perfect, but if you manage people's expectations accordingly, they'll actually be grateful for the effort made to offer some form of multilingualism. And there are some small lessons learned as well that we've run into. For instance, avoid typos. Because if you put that into a machine translation, the machine might not recognize what you're talking about. So that's something very basic that we've already started cleaning up with some member states we work with. And to use simple languages. I mean, I live in Paris, and the French have sometimes very complicated ways of saying very simple things. And it's also about thinking simple. Because if you think simple in your own language, well, when the machine reads what you're trying to say, the machine will guess it right. It won't try getting into what were you thinking on that day and was the sun shining or not, etc. So think simple. Build a thesaurus as well and create good practices around that as well to say, if there are people publishing data in a similar field, try to get them all to call a cat, or not a feline or a four-legged furry animal that purrs sometimes. And we've seen that, for instance, in the UK, when we worked with the Cabinet Office on harvesting their data for the European Data Portal, they've got 77 ways of spelling Scotland. So it says it all, and it says that even for countries where you might expect that to be pitch perfect, well, there's still a long way to go, and many countries are actually pausing on the publishing of data to do that effort of using controlled vocabularies, of building data models to ensure that the data is right, not simply from when it's published, but from when it's actually collected. Because the earlier you get it right into the process, the easier it is to finalize it all. So at this stage, if we can launch the video, I could go on for ages on a number of questions that I've heard and presentations on on the revised PSI directive. And here, typically to conclude before launching the short video that will present a bit more about open data and the European Data Portal, go take a look at the portal, see what you can find in terms of language resources, and at this stage, yes, multilingualism does matter, because today, if we want to access things that are happening in a borderless world that is offered by the digital economy, having this in a multilingual context matters a lot. So